Welcome to Man About Danville with Logan H. Gurman, a podcast for Danville, Kentucky and beyond. Conversations with friends, and you get to listen. Brought to you by the Logan Company, a commercial and residential real estate brokerage for Danville and Central Kentucky. 80% Danville-centric, 20% eccentric.
Good morning, Danville, Kentucky. Welcome to another episode of Man About Danville, Danville, Kentucky's favorite podcast. I am Logan H. Gurman, the man about Danville himself. First of all, thanks for listening. Wherever you might be listening, here in Danville, Perryville, Junction City, down on the Fork, Mitchellsburg, Harrodsburg, Lexington, Louisville, Bowling Green, Murray, Pikeville, Indianapolis, Portland, Oregon, Atlanta, Denver, Nashville, Chattanooga, Memphis, Little Rock, or even Carrick, Fergus, Northern Ireland, I consider it a real honor and privilege that you choose to spend part of your day with me. I sincerely appreciate it. Well, it's been a minute. It's been a minute since I've released an episode. Got kind of busy there in the fourth quarter of 2022. Realized that I had a lot more free time during the pandemic to get these episodes out on a regular basis. I'm sorry for the delay, but here I am. Thanks for everybody for sticking with me. I hope you enjoy this episode. I have plans to continue doing episodes. I just don't know when and where I'll be able to get them out, but I will. There are still a lot of people that I want to have conversations with, a lot of people I want to talk to in and around our community, and maybe a few folks even further afield. But I'm glad to be back with you right this moment. Thanks for listening. By the way, you can check me out on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all those places at Man About Danville. I think Twitter is at Man Danville. If you search Man About Danville on any podcast platform, you can find these episodes. Be sure to share it with your friends, subscribe, give me a review or whatever when you can. I appreciate those. All right, I am pleased to be joined today by my friend, colleague, peer, and occasional political rival, Stuart Sanders. Stuart, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Logan. Appreciate you having me.
Stuart, I'll give some background. You're a center graduate, then you worked at the Perryville battlefield. Now you work for the Kentucky
Historical Society.
Correct. There. I've been to your office. You work with my friend Scott Alvey that I met through Leadership Kentucky.
Yep.
He's a good guy, possibly a future guest too. I did not do Leadership just to get guests for this show. Some people think that, and no, I did it for lots of reasons. That may have been one of them, but it was the only reason. But anyway, Stuart, thanks for being with me. We're glad you're here. You're from Lexington, Virginia.
Yep. Got
here to go to center.
Right.
And then what happened?
Well, I went home for about 9 months looking for a job, and then ended up becoming an employee of the Perryville Battlefield Preservation Association, which was a group that was preserving and interpreting the battlefield, and was there for about 10 years, actually, and became executive director and, very proud of the work that everybody did out there. When we started our efforts, only 98 acres of the battlefield were preserved. Now I think it's close to 1,100 probably. So, it's really become a national model for battlefield preservation. So, it's something for everybody in the county to be really proud of.
Whether you've got an historical interest or you just want to go out there and walk around, and of course they have special events throughout the year that are cool, and ghost walks and the reenactment that they have every year. But it's just a beautiful asset here in the county. And if you haven't been out there, go check it out.
Definitely. And the recreation, it's sort of an added benefit of the historic preservation. I think there's something like 12 miles of walking trails out there now. So, if you want to go out and run around somewhere in the county, it's a great place to do it. And
there are a couple of nesting bald eagles out there too, I think.
Uh-huh.
One of these days I'm going to take my camera and go camp out until I get some pictures of them. So then after you left the battlefield, is that when you went to the Kentucky Historical Society?
It is, yeah. So I've been there 18 years, and I've basically worked in every corner of the building, to be honest. I'm now director of research and collections. That includes the library, the archives, the museum collection, and then some of the digital projects and publications that we do.
Explain that a little further.
Sure.
I've seen you in action. I've been to your office, or is it a museum?
Well, it's a little of both. We're the Kentucky Historical Society. We have a campus, so it includes the Thomas D. Clark Center for Kentucky History, and then also the Kentucky Military History Museum at the Old State Arsenal, and then finally Kentucky's Old State Capitol building as well. And so we have well over 100,000 museum objects, everything from, Henry Clay's cufflinks to Abraham Lincoln's pocket watch to the 1 millionth Toyota Camry that rolled off the line in Georgetown. So an incredible collection of everything from portraits, military vehicles, textiles and clothing and quilts, you name it, we've got it. And so we've got a state-of-the-art museum on the campus, and then we have these, again, other two sites that we also have interpretive areas and exhibit space. And then we also have a library and an archive. So we have researchers from all over the world who come to, look into our archives and do research related to Kentucky history.
And you say from all over the world, you're not kidding. When I was there, I think there was a young man from Scotland who was popping in.
Yeah, he was University of Edinburgh doing Civil War research. And this last year, we've had people from France, Spain, the French. The scholar from France is really interesting. She's researching Daniel Boone, for example. So, Kentucky history, spreads everywhere, and people have an interest in it no matter where they are. So it's been fun to see that happen and to kind of help facilitate some of this research.
And you're married, a couple of kids.
Yep.
What's your wife do?
She is an assistant attorney general in the criminal appeals division. So she was a public defender here for a number of years and now works for the Attorney General's office.
She now works on the prosecuting side.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah.
In your free time,
right,
you're a bit of a writer.
I try. Yeah.
I've got some of your book. What all have you written? Let's go over the things you've already written.
Yeah, sure. So I've really, since I was at Center, I've been doing freelance magazine writing. So I've written dozens of magazine articles, newspaper columns, journal articles, things like that. But I've done 5 books. The first one I wrote was called Perryville Under Fire, the Aftermath of Kentucky's Largest Civil War Battleground. So it's about what happened basically when the firing stopped and how did the aftermath of the Battle of Perryville affect not only that community, but also surrounding areas like Danville and Harrodsburg and other communities. My second book was on the Battle of Mill Springs, Kentucky, which was recently named a national park. That was an important early Civil War battle, important early victory for the Union that was fought down near Somerset in Pulaski County. My third book was called Manny's Confederate Brigade at the Battle of Perryville. It's sort of a command study about one particular brigade that endured probably the heaviest casualties of the battlefield. And then my fourth book is called Murder on the Ohio Belle, which really looks at kind of interpersonal violence and vigilante justice and Southern honor culture through the lens of 2 murders that took place on a steamboat in 1856. That
was your attempt to get on the true crime wave.
Yeah. Well, that's one way to look. I mean, it was interesting. I stumbled across that story. I was doing research for my next book, which comes out in November, and found this short newspaper article about a man who'd been found thrown and drowned in the Mississippi River. He'd been tied to a chair. And so they found this body bobbing in the river. And I thought, well, what happened to this poor guy? There's just a short newspaper article about it. And, started digging into it and realized, hey, there's sort of a more interesting story here than just one murder. So, it looks at a lot of themes, including sort of life on the Mississippi and, what was it like to be on a steamboat during that period, including a lot of the interpersonal violence that went on.
It sounds like it could have been an episode of Maverick starring Jim Garner.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. A kind of sad version of Maverick with people getting drowned in the river, though. It may not have met TV standards in the 1960s.
But no happy ending there for the guy that wound up in the chair.
Yeah. And that was my fifth book, which was, kind of fun to do. There's still some Civil War stuff related to that. And then my next book that comes out in November it's called Anatomy of a Duel. And it's about essentially looks at the secession crisis and the evolution of violence in Kentucky through the lens of a duel that took place in May of 1862 between a Union colonel and a pro-Confederate civilian.
So that was during the Civil War?
Yeah, during early stages of the war, and was fought up near Maysville, Kentucky. And they fought with Colt revolving rifles at 60 yards. So not a typical pistol duel, but kind of one man ended up getting killed and sort of had consequences that filtered down.
And you've done a lot of research on dueling, and you've challenged me to a duel a time or two. But I've
right,
because I have aspirations of being governor. Obviously,
right.
I haven't participated in any such, and we've got an argument over who gets to have John Kincaid as a second.
That's true.
But you've done a lot of research into dueling culture.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there are actually a few duels that took place in Boyle County as well. And there's a guy who's buried in the Presbyterian churchyard on Main Street who actually died in a duel. There were 2 brothers-in-law who got in an argument over the treatment of the wife, and they ended up fighting a duel on an island on Dix River, actually, and one killed the other. And then the victor to escape prosecution, ended up fleeing for Missouri and ended up living there and got in a few other personal scrapes. So, this county also has sort of an interesting dueling history as well. But, one of the forgotten casualties of these duels, lies buried here off Main Street.
So do you reckon that island is now Dunn Island or Gwynn Island that exists in the lake, or were they islands at that time? I don't know.
Not sure. That's one of those things.
Or it may be underwater completely.
Yeah, I guess it's probably underwater. It was described as being fairly small, so I don't think it was, one of the bigger ones that's out there now. But I haven't done a ton of research on that story. I did a little bit, while working on the book, but never kind of dug into that detail.
All right, so let's go back to Perryville and the time. What years were you working there?
So I was there from 96 until about 2005.
Golly, 2005. That's longer ago than we think.
Yeah, I know.
That's like 18 years ago.
Yeah, 18 years ago.
And this may be episode 1 of season 3 for me, because I started this thing in 2000, when the COVID thing hit.
Yeah.
And so here we are. How did you like working at the battlefield?
I loved it. I worked for a separate nonprofit that was preserving the land, but we worked closely with the park all the time. But, that gave me the opportunity to meet, tons of great – my office is right downtown and what was then the Perryville Community Center on the second floor. And, I got to meet just a number of wonderful people who were still there, advocating for the community of Perryville. And it was great. Just sort of, being able to work with a project that has such an important, long-lasting legacy, for tourism development here, for, again, that kind of recreation we talked about. It was, really fun. And just growing up in Lexington, Virginia, both Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson are buried there. I mean, it has a huge Civil War history. And I started working in high school at a Civil War museum there. So, it was right up my alley in terms of work, and never felt like I was working.
And your dad's professor of history at Washington.
Yeah, he's retired now, but taught there for about 41 or 42 years. So it's there a long time. Were
you involved with like land acquisition? Were you guys working with like private landowners to get them to contribute their land into the park system?
Yeah, we had a federal grant because of the work they did on US 150. If you remember, that was sort of straightened out and widened a little bit. Because of that, we had a federal transportation grant to buy land from willing property owners at appraised price. So we had, appraisers who would go do the appraisal, then we would sort of offer what we could, which was, again, that appraised price, and, only dealt with willing property owners who then bought it. Then we would make sure the land was sort of environmentally sound, that we'd turn it over to the park. And so by the time I left, I think we'd added, 600 or 700 acres. And then after I left, the work continued, and it's now close to 1,000 out there.
Okay. That's a lot of acreage.
It is. And, most of the main battle lines are now covered, which is great. I mean, so you've got, the nice thing about it, it's such a pristine, unspoiled place. I mean, there's a former chief historian of the National Park Service who said, when you go to Perryville, you're literally walking in the footsteps of history. And what you're seeing is really close, with the exception of a few power lines. It's really close to what a Civil War soldier would have seen. So, for people who want to learn more about the Civil War, it's sort of a great place to go because of that unspoiled landscape. You get a great sense of what transpired there.
And all over the park, they have markers that explain who was doing what, when, and where.
Right, in that area. Because it became really important for us. I worked with Kurt Holman, the then park manager, on doing the first interpretive trail out there. We did about 7 miles of trails. And, we would buy this land. It was important for us to interpret it quickly. So, general visitors would have an understanding of why we were buying this particular parcel of land. So we may get something on, the Union right flank, and people may go, well, why are you buying this? This is just an old cow field. But then once you interpret it, people get a much better sense of what actually happened there and how it's important to the wider story of the history of the area.
And that's what it was at the time of the battle, too. It was just farmland.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, most of the land was actually owned by Henry P. Bottom. His house still stands on the battlefield, still has bullet holes in the wall. It's private property, so you can't visit it. But he was a cabinet maker and a local justice of the peace, was in his mid-40s at the time, and owned most of that property. He had a few tenant houses as well. They got, battered by cannonballs, for example. But, the battle changed his life. I mean, you look at sort of civilian casualties of the battle. He was sort of certainly one of them from a psychological perspective. He lost something like, 9 cows, 2 horses, 30 sheep, 22 tons of hay, 8,000 pounds of pork, 8,000 pounds of bacon. I mean, the list of his losses goes on. And he had a barn that was struck by an artillery shell and caught on fire and burned down. And then, the soldiers, he had roughly 80,000 troops in the air. They just sort of swept his land completely clean. And then after the battle, he ended up burying most of the Confederate dead who were lying scattered across his property because the Union Army refused to bury any Confederates at that time.
And remind me how many men were lost in the battle.
Yeah, 7,500 were killed and wounded.
Imagine 7,500 bodies laying strewn across fields. It's hard to wrap your mind around. It is.
And one of my favorite sort of statistics, it's kind of a weird way to put it, but there were so many sick soldiers too who were traveling with the Army. And here in Danville, Danville had roughly 3,500 inhabitants in 1862. But there were more than 3,000 sick Union soldiers who were left here. So, I mean, the population of the town nearly doubled just by sick soldiers alone. So the courthouse, churches, public buildings were all full of sick and some wounded soldiers too.
Yeah, anybody that has a house that predated the battle can claim that it was a Civil War hospital.
Yeah, and records show. I mean, Center College was full. I mean, Old Center, the main college building. If you're looking at that building on the left-hand side, there's a wing, and that wing was used as sort of a postmortem or an embalming room. And the Episcopal Church across from the courthouse was. I think there were probably well over 100 patients in that building, too.
And that's not a big building.
It's not. And the sad part is there was, in February of 1860, there had been a horrible fire in Danville that destroyed a number of buildings. And the congregation of that church had just gotten it fixed up. And so, they endured this fire. I mean, only the walls were left standing. They end up repairing it. And then literally weeks later, they have well over 100 sick Union soldiers were thrown in there. And plaster was ruined. Pews were chopped up for firewood. The pulpit was destroyed. Prayer books were ruined, walls were written on, windows were broken. I mean, the list of damages just goes on and on and on. And so, I mean, we went to a funeral at that church recently, for example, and, there's not a time I don't go in that building or the Presbyterian Church on Main Street and don't think about, the number of soldiers who actually died within those walls. It's sort of a real sobering thought. And the courthouse is the same way. It was occupied for a long time. And Constitution Square has a connection, too. That was the site of, Kentucky's 10 constitutional conventions. And that space also became a major field hospital. And, there were Union and Confederate sick who were in buildings on that campus, too. So, again, the footprint of the aftermath of the battle sort of everywhere.
All right. So back to dueling. Not that we're going to actually participate in one for the purposes of this podcast. How commonplace were those around the time of the Civil War, after the Civil War, and when did they go away?
Yeah, dueling has an interesting culture in Kentucky. It was sort of brought here from Easterners, probably Virginians who came into the Commonwealth, of course.
Who were bringing it over from England and France?
Yeah, eventually, that's sort of how it got its start. Every state sort of had their own kind of dueling culture in a sense. Different things would trigger duels. Duels were handled differently. And Kentucky was a little more wide open, in South Carolina.
As one could imagine.
Yeah,
exactly. Out here on the frontier.
Right. And, it's a situation where in a lot of instances, pistols at 10 paces, which would be about 30 feet, was considered, the standard gentlemanly duel. But in Kentucky, they were a little looser on the rules. So the way it worked, if I challenged you, for example, you would then get to pick the time and the place and the weapon that was used. So in Kentucky, a lot of these guys ended up picking rifles, for example.
Because they were generally handier than a hand.
Handier. And, they were just sort of, with the culture of hunting that was going on then too, there were better rifle shots. And, Abraham Lincoln, when he was in Illinois, for example, was actually challenged to a duel, and he picked broadswords because this sort of more diminutive guy had challenged him. And he knew that if they used swords, that Lincoln would have hacked the guy to pieces.
It's a wonder he didn't pick a timbering axe.
Yeah, exactly. Well, kind of close to it, really, when you think about it. But he, I think he sort of knew the guy would, and then the guy canceled the duel, essentially, and kind of backed off. But, Kentucky was also a place where people from other states would come in, because dueling was illegal, of course. And if you were a Kentuckian who dueled, if you were an attorney, for example, you'd lose your law license. You couldn't run for office. And so, people chuckle because there's still an oath, when you're sworn into a state office.
It's in the Constitution.
Yeah. Yep. Still in there, part of the 1850 Constitution that, if you're running for office or want to be a politician, you have to swear that you've never dueled or acted as a second before. So, that culture is still around. But, dueling kind of went away during the Civil War. There's a chapter in my forthcoming book is about kind of one of the last duels in Kentucky, which was fought in 1866 between a former Confederate soldier and a former Union guy. But their animosity sort of had its roots before the war when they were in school together. They hated one another, got in a fist fight at a local tavern, and that ended up spinning off into a duel. And they actually fought that one at what is now the Horse Park.
Right at the Scott-Fayette County line.
Exactly.
And that was for a reason, too.
Right, yeah. Because then you couldn't basically, prosecutors could sort of dodge having to charge these guys, for example. You could elude prosecution by claiming, you didn't know what side of the county line you fought on. But
you didn't know which sheriff was supposed to arrest you.
Right, exactly. And there were actually several duels fought at the horse park. There were two Transylvania University students who fought there once, for example. I think they used shotguns loaded with slugs, and one blew the head off the other one. Yeah, pretty grim stuff. I mean, in most dueling was not always to the death. It was typically, there'd be times if the two men shot at one another and missed, they would say, yeah, kind of honor's been satisfied. We don't need to go on any further. But sometimes, they wanted blood drawn, and so it would end if one person got wounded. But in several instances, Kentuckians were killed while dueling. And so it is a grim history, but I just find it sort of fascinating.
Did it kind of evolve into gunfighting in the Old West?
I think so. That's what most people think. I mean, in Missouri is a good example, kind of Missouri and Kansas. I mean, Kentuckians were some of the people who took that dueling culture into Missouri. And then I think as firearms changed, as the culture changed, it became more of that sort of – I think the quick draw is a little bit of a myth in a sense, but, that interpersonal violence and sort of one person standing across from the other certainly does have its roots in it. And, in the 1850s, there were a lot of duels fought in California, for example, by Southerners who'd gone out there for the gold rush, or, politicians were fighting out there. And that kind of, I found a few instances of guys later dueling with sort of six shooters in a sense, like Colt Navy or Colt Army revolvers. And I think that did end up kind of becoming that, what we think of being kind of gunslingers fighting.
That part of the American mythology.
Right. And it certainly has its roots in dueling, I'd say. All
right. So after the Civil War ended, did those Union sick guys, did they stick around? Did they become part of the permanent population, or did they go home? Or
no, most ended up leaving. They were from all over the Midwest, and so most of these guys ended up going home. There's some pretty interesting accounts I found, though, of families coming down from Minnesota, Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana, other states to sort of retrieve their loved ones. And that sort of leads to interesting stories, too. There's one woman from Maxville, Wisconsin, I think it was, who ended up coming down to find her brother who'd been shot in the head, and ended up finding him, and he survived, the war. She took him back home. But, I've always found Boyle County during the war was an exceptionally interesting place. I mean, Kentucky was it was a pro-slavery, pro-union state. And out of all the counties in this area, at least, this county was sort of overwhelmingly pro-union. There were some Confederate elements here, of course, but for the most part, it was very much pro-unionist. And, so there was that Confederate monument on Main Street, of course, that has since been moved. But I've always found that one to be kind of ironic because it was such a union community. It was always sort of strange for them to have a Confederate monument here, really. But that just shows how after the war, Kentucky took a notable pro-Confederate turn. And, that was really because of the Emancipation Proclamation, which Kentucky's despised at the time. And also, importantly, the enlistment of black Union soldiers up at Camp Nelson. It was met with sort of really violence from pro-slavery white Kentuckians. And kind of, a number of Union officers resigned after the Emancipation Proclamation, things like that. And that, also kind of takes a notable post-war twist, too, because, there are a number of racially inspired lynchings after the war. And there's also kind of vigilante justice in general that involved both whites and blacks.
Well, there were racially motivated lynchings, but there are also plain old lynchings.
Oh, yeah,
just outlaw lynchings.
Right. Yeah.
People coming in from other counties that were causing trouble.
Right. Yeah, and I ended up...
And I'm not saying Marion County specifically.
Well, I'll mention Marion County, but, there are... It's really interesting. I'm also working on a book that kind of talks about Reconstruction era violence in Boyle, Mercer, Marion, surrounding counties, because it was so prevalent. And, you have lawlessness or kind of, justice in the justice system and kind of breaks down during the war. So in 1866, you had a number of probably former guerrillas who would ride up from Lebanon, that area, up into Perryville and sort of, raise hell, shooting up toll booth houses, robbing people, things like that. So eventually, a number of former soldiers got together, called themselves the Regulators, and sort of would go around, lynching people who were accused of crime.
We Danvillians tend to think pretty highly of ourselves. It's
sure.
We need to remember we always haven't had the best track record, or the track record we'd like to think.
Yeah, I mean, because you think slavery was very prevalent here, and there were men and women who were sold on the courthouse steps here, and so when you drive by the courthouse, it's sort of a permanent reminder of the cost of slavery in a lot of ways. And that vigilante justice, too, was a pretty dark period. And I do think, of course, it has its roots in the Civil War. And there was, there's a fire that took place, I think, in 1876 in Danville, I think, too. And they think that was probably started by arson because a man had been lynched. So, it was kind of a revenge for that lynching. And a big chunk of the town actually burned down in that period. So, there was a lot of violence going on after the war. And, it took kind of another generation for a lot of that to get stopped.
So that's what it was, about another generation worth?
Yeah, I think so. It's all that. It was statewide. And I talk about this in the forthcoming book, too, like how did violence evolve in Kentucky? And it took, again, a generational shift, but it's one of those things that sort of helped sully Kentucky's post-war reputation. It was we used to be seen as the erudite home of Henry Clay, the great compromiser, and all these other prominent politicians like John J. Crittenden and many, many more. But then after the war, these tales of violence were appearing in newspapers across the country, and it ended up just sort of damaging our state's reputation.
What about like the Hatfield and the McCoys?
Yeah,
was that about the same time?
It was. I mean, they were a little bit later, I think 1880s, but you have the assassination of Governor Goebel in 1900. He was the only governor to ever die from an assassin's bullet. So that whole period from, post-Civil War, the 1860s on to about 1900 really ended up, making other people around the country see Kentucky as just this lawless place. And, they weren't necessarily wrong. There was violence here, but there was violence everywhere at that time. And, one buddy of mine once pointed out that, there's a huge prevalence of firearms after the Civil War, too. I mean, they were just being sold as surplus everywhere. So you had people walking around armed, when they would have a problem or if there was drinking involved, it would end up leading to a shootout. So, for a lot of these upper crust Kentuckians, sort of the blue-blooded aristocracy of the state, for lack of a better term, men who would have dueled prior to 1860, then started toting concealed weapons, running around and having kind of spur-of-the-moment shootouts as opposed to, challenging one another to a duel. So, that didn't help Kentucky's reputation either. But, it's really just sort of a fascinating period, and that kind of post-war violence that involves, kind of men who are, leaders in the state is pretty compelling.
All right. A couple of books I want to pick your brain. Have you read Early Days in Danville? I assume you have.
Yeah, Calvin Fackler's. Yeah, great book.
And the other one is Iron Baby Angel.
I've got a copy of that. Yeah, I've never read it, but I've got a copy of it.
It was on my list to read, and I read about the first third of it. And I just got bogged down with it. And my understanding is it was written around the turn of the 20th century?
I think so. And it kind of more like reminiscences of one guy's reminiscences of what Danville was once like.
Maybe he wrote it in the 30s or 40s about life in Danville. And it was thinly veiled as to who he was talking about. He changed the names of people's ever so slightly so that you knew exactly who he was talking about. There were a lot of caricatures of actual Danvillians, both prominent and infamous. Yeah,
and I think it's pretty, it's a very nostalgic look, I think, at Danville of that period, too. Like, very much tinted through rose-colored glasses, I think, probably.
But I'm sure by then we'd put all the vigilantism and dueling and all that behind us. We were just on.
Yeah, I mean, 1880s, there was still quite a bit of, things were still pretty rough. There was one judge who said that, that, Danville, he was here for a murder trial, and he talked about how Danville sort of ranked up there with murders like any other, it had as many murders as, Lexington and Louisville at the time, so it was sort of seen as being pretty violent too. I don't know how accurate that is, but, certainly there were shootouts in courthouses in the area. I mean, in Mercer County once there was two families got in a gunfight and, dozens of shots were fired. There was one man who killed another outside of the courthouse here after a lawsuit. So there's these sort of stories of violence that are now kind of forgotten, but the buildings still remain, which is kind of interesting.
Well, I had no idea we had such a sordid past.
Yeah, a little bit of that, but hopefully I can get this book done and,
All right, so what's the book coming out in the fall?
So, again, it's called Anatomy of a Duel, be out in November, and that's the one about the duel between the Union colonel and a pro-Confederate civilian.
Okay. And that's the one you're currently working on?
Well, it's done now. It's been turned into the publisher.
Okay.
So, it's typically there's about a year wait for a book to come out. It's the University Press, Kentucky, who've been great to work with.
And what would you say is your most accessible book? Which one should I start with first?
Probably, for somebody who's local, probably Perryville Under Fire, just because it has a lot of the human interest stories and, talks about places that are still around, like Shaker Village, like Constitution Square, Center College. All these places are landmarks that were massive hospitals after the battle.
So Shakertown was well established at the time of the Civil War.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And there were a number of wounded men who were left there. Like Harrodsburg, when the Confederates fled the battlefield, they took most of their wounded to Harrodsburg, and they left them there. And so there were about 1,700 Confederate wounded who were left there. And Harrodsburg at the time had a population of around 1,700. So like Danville, the population nearly doubled as a result of all these wounded men who were left there. And a lot of men died there. A lot of amputations went on without any chloroform at all and anesthesia. So, pretty grim circumstances after Kentucky's largest battle. There were troops who were sent up to Louisville, for example. So, like New Albany, Indiana hospitals were full of casualties from Perryville. So, you think of this massive footprint that the aftermath had because of the number of casualties, and because Perryville had 300 people in it at the time. They just couldn't contend with these thousands of sick and thousands of wounded people.
If one were going to order one of your books, what's the best place to do it?
Amazon. They're on Amazon. Most online booksellers have copies.
Okay.
They're all pretty accessible.
If I had the wherewithal, I would set up an Amazon affiliate link. And that would be smart. And put that in the show notes if I could figure out. I'll have to get one of my interns to work on that for me. They've got their hands full. So.
They do. Pretty busy.
Yeah, here at the Man About Danville downtown tower.
Yeah, appears they're all working their fingers to the bone.
They are.
You might want to lay off a little bit.
Well, we're school's back in, but we got a lot of catching up to do here. All right, Stuart, what else? Anything exciting going on for you in the near future?
Just working on different projects and, enjoying the work of the Kentucky Historical Society. So encourage people to come up. And we've got, in our permanent exhibit, there's a lot to see related to Danville. We've got Portrait of Ethan McDowell. That's great. Two of my favorite objects are portraits we have of Dennis and Diademia Dorham, who were...
I'm sorry.
Yeah, Dennis and Diademia Dorham.
Is that a woman's name?
Yep.
Diademia.
Yeah, Diademia. And they were free African-Americans who lived here in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s who made a fortune in the hemp business. So we actually have their portraits at the Kentucky Historical Society. You can see them online. So if you just Google up, if you go to history.ky.gov.
Did I see these when I was up there?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I would have pointed out. And they were found in a barn, and we actually had them restored, and now they're really a centerpiece of our exhibit. The portrait of Diademia, the wife, is now it's on loan temporarily to the DAR in Washington D.C. But Dennis is still up there, and you can see both of them online. And that's just a few feet from Ethan McDowell's portrait. You go around the corner, and there's a whole display about the aftermath of the Battle of Perryville. Sort of a big kind of diorama with mannequins. With a scaled down version of the bottom house. So. Boyle County has a pretty prominent footprint in our museum, which I'm proud of.
You also have an exciting collection thanks to Colonel Chin.
We do.
And for those of you that don't know Colonel Chin.
Yeah, he was the executive director of the Kentucky Historical Society. He was from Harrodsburg. He was a Marine during World War II and a weapons inventor. And so he had invented the fully automatic grenade launcher, for example. And when he was director of the Kentucky Historical Society, he actually got us a major federal firearms collection. So we have one of the best 20th century weapons collection in the country. It's basically an encyclopedic collection of machine guns and submachine guns. And
there's a great biography of him that I read.
Yeah.
And if you're going on 68 toward Lexington, there's that hole that's a cave, and that was his house / illegal casino / saloon / ammunition dump.
A restaurant, if you will. But the story was he would shoot machine guns into the Palisades off of his farm, which is interesting. But I'm fascinated by his father, who's Colonel Jack Chin, who's he had a horse, Leonidas, that won the Kentucky Derby, and he lived in Mercer County. And he was sort of a renowned knife fighter, and he carried this massive 8-inch long bone-handled switchblade. And so he got in a number of tussles with that knife, and he was actually with Goebel when Goebel was assassinated, was walking up the Capitol lawn when Goebel was shot.
Now that's all news to me. I never knew there was any prominence to General Chin's father.
Yeah, and Colonel Jack, and he had supposedly ridden with rebel horsemen as a 16-year-old, and was a starter for a number of horse races. That was sort of how he got his career. Was sort of starting. Horse races. And, this is before they had the gates, for example. He'd just sort of have to stand out there, keep them in line, and then wave a handkerchief. But I'm working on a couple projects where he's a peripheral figure, and he's fascinating. Very much, the interpersonal violence. The New York Times one time ran a headline that just said Colonel Chin's knife. And, readers would have been familiar with what they were talking about because he'd gotten in a big knife fight somewhere at one of the horse races. I think it's Chicago or somewhere.
This predates the Bowie knife, which...
Well, the Bowie knife would have been before that.
Oh, it would have. Okay,
yeah.
okay.
And this was just this massive switchblade he carried. But, it was sort of it didn't help Kentucky's reputation because people see this idea of a bourbon-soaked colonel, Kentucky colonel wearing a white
that we
suit.
now name all of our school mascots after.
Yeah, I know. But it's it all ties back to that post-war violence. But he's a fascinating character, and so you can see how Colonel Chin, our executive director, ended up becoming really proficient with firearms. I mean, his father was too, and the whole family's really interesting. So hopefully I can get those projects finished up about Colonel Jack.
But you ever watch Forged in Fire, that TV show?
Uh-huh.
They had an episode where they whittle it down to two people, and these two guys, all right, go home and make a Spanish Navarro,
right? Which
is like a ratcheting folding knife, but
right.
it's the length of a short sword.
Huh.
So I wonder if what Colonel Chin carried was something akin to that. It doesn't necessarily open fast, and
right.
part of that ratcheting sound was to be intimidating,
right?
To let somebody know you were brandishing said.
Yeah, I think his knife was described as a spring clasp knife, so I think it's sort of like
more
like an early switchblade, yeah. But it was evidently huge, and I think he may have let. There's another prominent fight that took place in the Lexington post office in the 1880s, where there were two Republican Party operatives who hated each other. And I'm going to draw a blank on their names, of course. But they ended up they encountered one another in the post office in Lexington. One had a .38 pistol, a Smith & Wesson. The other had a large knife. And I think he may have borrowed it from Jack Chin. And they ended up killing each other. The one guy shot the other, but the man who'd been shot who had the knife ended up then grabbing the guy by the pistol arm and stabbed him 13 times and killed him. So both of them died. And these were two prominent Republican Party operatives. Huh. And I think there's a book being written on that episode too, which I'm excited to read. But grisly scenes in post offices in Lexington.
You got any good Danville stories?
Oh gosh, I mean, from the Civil War. I mean, one interesting one that I don't think enough has been talked about is in March of 1863. There's a cavalry raid. There's about a brigade, so roughly 2,000 cavalrymen who came into this area to essentially steal cattle. So they ended up spreading out, stole cattle from, the Harrodsburg area, the Danville area. And the Union Army thought this was a prelude to another large invasion like the Perryville campaign. And so they all ended up sort of fleeing north of the Kentucky River to Camp Nelson. They ripped up the covered bridge there, took the planks out. But then they finally realized that, wait a minute, this is just sort of a minor cavalry excursion. So they then attacked these rebel cavalrymen here in Danville. There's a massive shootout and firefight down on Main Street. And there was actually a woman named Mildred Mitchell who was watching the battle unfold from her second floor window that I think was over near, across from Bricks and Brews, that area there.
Kind of on 4th Street?
Yeah, kind of upper 4th. And but she was shot and killed while she watched the battle unfold. And the bullet evidently went through her and then hit an enslaved girl that was in her house too. And Mildred Mitchell's buried in the Danville Cemetery and, was killed in, I think, March 23rd, 1863 or whenever it was. Then that fight, the Confederates got pushed out and ended up taking a stand again down near Somerset. And there's sort of a big, not a big battle, but another battle fought down there. But, there was violence in the streets of Danville during the Civil War. Also, too, William Clark Quantrell from Missouri, who was sort of this terrible guerrilla fighter who masterminded the Lawrence, Kansas massacre, led guys into Danville. They ended up robbing Danville in early 1865, I think it was. So, there's a lot more to the county's Civil War history than just Perryville. I mean, it sort of goes on and on. And then again, we have that continuation after the war of that sort of vigilante violence that had its roots in the Civil War, too.
Any nonviolent Danville stories you can think of?
Not really. No, yeah. No, and there's just such a rich history here. And I mean, I think, the educational institutions are so interesting. Like, the site of Constitution Square was the Presbyterian Theological Seminary for a long time. So a lot of these early ministers who were really important ended up, being educated there in its center. So, a lot of good stories related to those folks too.
All right. Well, Stuart, the interns are waving at me from the booth. They're letting me know that we are out of time for this episode. But thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Always good to see you.
We can find your books on Amazon. Just search Stuart Sanders, and there you will find them if I don't get an affiliate link up in the show notes.
Well, thanks. I really appreciate you having me.
And plan on coming back when you get the new one out, too.
We'll do. Yeah, in November.
I want to talk about it. Super.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks, Stuart. Once again, my thanks to author and historian Stuart Sanders. Thanks for being with me today. I'll throw a link to his books in the show notes there. And thanks to you, my listeners, for being patient. I'm sorry for the delay, sorry for the break, but I hope to be back on a somewhat more regular basis here in the near future with more conversations with people you want to get to know. Check me out on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, the YouTube, all those places. Look for Man About Danville. Be well, have a good weekend, and thanks for listening.
That's it. We're out. Thanks so much for listening. We really appreciate it. Subscribe to Man About Danville wherever you access your favorite podcasts, and be sure to tell your friends about us. You've been listening to Man About Danville with Logan H. Gurman, brought to you by the Logan Company, a commercial and residential real estate brokerage for Danville and Central Kentucky. Know someone who would be a good guest? Want to be a guest yourself? Have an idea for the show? Get in touch with us. Find all our contact information on the web at manaboutdanville.com. Thanks for joining us.